Hello, today we are sitting with Denae. She is going to talk to us a little bit about neurodivergence. And this is a space that I'm a little bit more unfamiliar with, so I learned so much from her, and I was grateful for her graciousness with my questions as I was seeking to better understand what it's like to be on the spectrum, to have ADHD. She herself is neurodivergent and has a few children that also are neurodivergent, and so can speak to differing experiences and has been very insightful for me. So she's really great. I'm excited for you to sit with her. As a side note, I am living out of state, away from my podcast recording stuff for the summer, and this was my first attempt at doing a virtual podcast through the software that I have. And so I will be honest, it's not great, but I commit to figure out a way to have better audio for you moving forward. Denae sounds great and the content's wonderful, so still stay and listen, but I apologize for that in advance. But with that, let's sit with Denae.
Okay, I'm so excited to sit with you and hear your story. I think if you start off by helping us get to know you a little bit better, and then we can dive into some of the questions and things that we're going to talk about.
I grew up in California, a small town. I have wonderful childhood memories, and I was one of 5 kids. I was born and raised in an LDS family, and we lived there until I graduated high school, and then we moved to Utah, and I did hair school. And then I met my husband. We have 5 children, and we've moved a few times. As far as neurodivergence goes, it's something that has been something I have been learning with and through my kids. And it wasn't until I learned so much for so many years and then started to go, hey, some of this fits me too. So then I started, realizing, and then I went to doctor anyway. So just within like maybe a year or two after I learned so much and done so much research, and my kids got diagnoses, and we have a lot of different things on the neurodivergent spectrum. And then I started recognizing those things in myself. And so I went to my family doctor and I was like, I think I have ADHD. And then with his help, we were able to figure out I certainly do have ADHD at least.
Okay, so how old are your kids then?
So I have 17, 15, 14, 12, and 11. We have 2 adopted kids, and they came to us. We adopted them through the foster care system. They were our first and only placement, and they were 2 and 6 when we got them.
Okay. So when was it that you had to first kind of dive into figuring it out and realizing there were some things that were hard for them?
So we started pretty young with like early intervention. Other kids, they had some early intervention, but things looked different. That it wasn't until much later. And their diagnoses came later when I felt there was a need at school to have more resources. They weren't diagnosed really young with their neurodivergencies, but we did do early intervention and different therapies and things to support them.
Okay. What does the world look like for someone in their shoes or your shoes, or I think you said maybe your spouse as well also is neurodivergent? What does life look like? Paint us a picture of some of those things that are really beautiful, some of those things that are really hard for someone that is neurodivergent.
Yeah, neurodivergent people are more likely to have learning disabilities. So school setting can be like really hard. Most of the time, school settings can be really hard for a lot of individuals with neurodivergence, whether it's ADHD or dyslexia or autism, or there's many other things that you could have. But a school setting can be really difficult. Our brains process the world a lot differently. And so things like IEPs and 504s can be really helpful, and still sometimes can be a real struggle to get the resources and help and support. But I would say school is probably the hardest thing. Academics, I do have one kid who thrives with academics though. So I like that it's called spectrum because it's a broad spectrum. There's no 2 people with the same diagnosis that are the same. Like, it's such a wide variety, and the ways that our brains might struggle for one person might flourish for another. But I would say overall, for our experiences, school has probably been the most stressful thing we've had. But there are also like superpowers, and I've really tried to drive that home for my kids that there are like actual superpowers with neurodivergence too. And like a brain can't have like absolute superpowers and all. We have
Mhm.
lots of categories of things we can have strengths and weaknesses in, and we can't like, so where we might have a superpower in one area, we might have a weakness in another. So anyway, so there's both wonderful things like what I call superpowers, like things we can be really good at. And then there's other things, maybe academics, that can be challenging. And maybe it's not the academics themselves. Maybe for somebody with ADHD, it might be just sitting in a chair.
Yeah, sitting down. What are some
Yeah.
of the superpowers that you see in you or your kids?
Yeah. I would say like multitasking. If you have ADHD, that can sometimes be a blessing and a curse. Sometimes I can be really good at it and be working on 100 different things. And then sometimes I get overstimulated and have a burnout. And I hear that I'm not the only one that experiences that. I think like social norms and people on the spectrum tend to be more honest, and maybe some people that might come across as like rude or harsh. And I don't know, I grew up with friends looking back that I'm like, oh, maybe they had some neurodivergence because everybody hated them because they were so brutally honest. But I found it refreshing. I was like, thank you for telling me what you're thinking and not lying. You know what I mean?
100%. But I know
Yeah.
how it can get people in trouble too sometimes.
Yeah, which the cultural norm could look at that as like a bad thing. I think it's refreshing and wish more of us would see how we feel. But I would say hardworking is a superpower, and hardworking might not look the exact same for somebody with a neurotypical brain, but you have to, I think, learn a lot of grit, having to figure things out the way that your brain works. Sometimes high energy, a lot of energy, hyper focusing, especially on something that we might have a special interest in. Pattern recognition, details. I'm very detail oriented. I also have done photography, and that has served me well because I'm like, you have a phone in your pocket, you have a piece of hair flying. um, uh, Creativity, artistic. A lot of people who are neurodivergent might thrive in the arts. I have a really strong like long-term memory. My short-term memory is not as good, but my long-term memory is, I have memories from when I was like less than 2 years old, which I don't think most
Amazing.
people do.
Yeah, I do
Yeah.
not.
Going along with the honesty, integrity, resilience, enthusiasm. Somebody who might, like with dyslexia, might really struggle to read, might be very strong with their verbal communication skills. And adaptability, quick thinking. The superpowers are like endless, honestly, and it really just depends person to person. Some people have special interests and they are an absolute expert because they have read every book, every website, and they know everything about that special interest.
That's interesting you say that too because my brother does have dyslexia. So I guess I shouldn't have said I have no connection to the world of neurodivergence, but he
Yeah.
is so good with people. And so I do think that kind of what you're trying to say is sometimes we look at neurodivergence as a bad thing, where it's just like you said, sometimes we're trying to fit squares in round pegs or social norms. It's not that someone is struggles or is bad. It's just that in the society that we live in, that doesn't play to their strengths, and or being forced into school doesn't play to their strengths. Whereas like my brother outside of a sit down school setting, he's the most successful. So I do think that's really important to know.
Yes, I love that. I agree with that.
So do you have any like experiences or stories you can think of from own life or kids that could help us be a little bit more empathetic as parents or kids going to school with other people that are in that space?
Yeah. My experiences, one of my superpowers totally is empathy too. Like in my school setting, I remember always just daydreaming and checking out and not always getting all the information they were giving me, but my ability to realize if somebody was frustrated with me, maybe that's a survival skill that I learned, but tuning into people's emotions has definitely become a super power. And maybe I had some hard experiences that got me there, but it's also has definitely served me well. So assuming that one of the first things I think of is people who might be brutally honest or maybe aren't understanding that's not acceptable to say in a social setting, might come across as totally awkward, or I guess just being aware that they might not totally understand, but they might also be crazy sensitive and adaptive and receptive to any feedback in a kind, loving way, too. Anyway, and that they pick up, like, I don't know, I have one kid that is like me in that situation, and they will pick up if somebody has unkind intentions.
That's awesome. When we talked earlier, you talked a little bit about mental health. What does that look like, and how might it differ for someone with like neurotypical brain?
Somebody with a neurodivergent brain is at higher risk for mental health struggles for sure. Chronic stress and social expectations can cause extra stress. A lot of times people who are neurodivergent will mask, so they will act a certain way because they know they're supposed to, but they're not totally acting like themselves, so they get pretty exhausted and to fit in that how I'm supposed to behave.
Do you feel that?
Sometimes I'm like, I can be totally wild and childlike, and my demeanor is happy and playful, and I don't always show that. I'm definitely reserved when I'm in a situation. But once I know somebody and I feel safe, then I can totally let my guard down and be wild.
Childlike. I love it.
Yeah.
And yeah, anything else with mental health? Sorry, I cut you off.
Oh yeah, so that can play into mental health. Like a misdiagnosis or late diagnosis. I actually think it's good for mental health awareness to know. I feel like so many women who have dealt with like anxiety and depression their whole lives are like just now finding out they have ADHD. And it's, oh, if I knew my brain was working this certain way and all these stressors are really what's causing the depression or the anxiety, how different that may have looked if we had treated or had the support for this rather than treating this. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I was going to ask you that. I said, what is the power of diagnosing? Or a lot of people really want a diagnosis, but maybe like you, it's like they've lived however many years. But I see what you're saying is really important to just know this is how my brain works. This is how I can cope with it and navigate. So yeah, that's really insightful.
Yeah, absolutely. And I want to talk about that too. The other thing is like sensory and emotional regulation, like sensory seeking or sensory overload, and understanding that your brain is like either seeking that dopamine or trying to avoid those sensory. And just like realizing that and being like, okay, mom's having a sensory overload. I'm going to go in my room for 10 minutes and then we'll go to the park. And then my kids know to use that same language. Oh, I'm having a sensory overload. I need a minute. That can play into mental health, not even just understanding that this is like a sensory overload. I need a break. Just push through or mask or what's wrong with me? Why can't I deal with this?
I need to teach my 2-year-old and my 4-year-old those skills. Please go to your room. I have sensory overload with them as well. A lot of things you're saying, I do feel everyone should be learning a lot of these skills because maybe just one symptom, and maybe you wouldn't be diagnosed with, but learning how to cope with overload is something. Having toddlers at my house, I have learned what sensory overload is, and it's real, and it gives me empathy for people that have that in a different setting where I'm not having the sensory overload. And I'm like, okay, before I would have been like, come on, let's just get it together. But now that I feel it, I'm like, yeah, it's real and it's overwhelming.
Totally. And I'm like a firm believer in therapy, and we've done lots of therapy over the years, and it's just tools in the toolbox to help emotional regulation. And I think everybody could benefit from understanding those things. So you said it perfectly.
Anything else on mental health, or do you want to talk about diagnosing?
Oh, yeah. So I have two more things on mental health. So environmental mismatch, like not being accommodated, that can play into and feelings of inadequacy, isolation, feelings of failure. Growing up, I just thought I was dumb. I had a teacher tell my mom, I think she has a learning disability. And I felt like I would try really hard and I couldn't understand the math concepts. And I felt like I was running circles around everybody else, putting in the time and effort to learn a concept that everybody else could learn in the class period. Yeah, going back to that, you can have strengths and weaknesses in their brain. We can't all just have all the superpowers.
Do you feel like
Yeah.
then, is there enough, are we aware enough of neurodivergence in the school system today that educators were able to catch things with your children and say, maybe we can help them learn in a different way? Are they catching it, or are you as the parent, I'm sure you as the parent are saying, coming into it now and saying, this is where we're at? I don't know.
Yeah, there's a lot more support than there was when we were kids, for sure. Like we have ABA therapy, which is controversial, and we have like occupational therapy, and there's dyslexia centers and behavioral centers. We just have so much more awareness and support and understanding than we did then. And yeah, I think my mom, no ill will towards her. My mom is a saint, but in that time period, we didn't really understand there could be support for this.
Yeah.
We didn't understand or know what that looked like. I felt like I had like really good teachers who were really good at. I had one teacher who I think she had done some training in dyslexia because she helped me so much. I can still remember it. I think it was like in first grade, and she taught me to put a piece of paper under the line where I was reading. But yeah, I don't feel like the awareness was used to be there. Did that answer your question?
Yeah, but I'm also thinking, your kids now, are teachers coming to you and saying, hey, I noticed so and so is having a hard time learning this concept. Yeah. I think that they're stupid. I think that they need to learn a different way, or they just like implementing different things anyway in the school setting.
Okay, this is actually a really unfortunate thing, is that legally they can't give their personal opinions, or they can't like chime in with their expertise. I think there's some like legal things there that keep them from coming to us with that kind of information. I've always come in with the information and the diagnoses, and I've had to fight for IEPs and 504s. So an IEP is like an individualized education plan, which I'm like, honestly, every kid should have an individualized education plan.
Okay.
But it's if a kid needs to retake a test or take a test in a quiet place, or if they need to go for a walk in the hall, like in between assignments or whatever, it's just to help that child be successful, giving them like accommodations where they need them. And a 504 is a little bit less supportive, but I feel like a 504 is more like backup more than actively supporting your student, but people might have differing views on that.
Okay, I just didn't know what they were.
Yeah. So yeah, teachers these days can't really be like, they can show you their test scores and be like, look, this is where they are in reading. These are the things I would suggest doing at home. But as far as saying, I'm suspicious that your child has dyslexia, they can't. Like legally, I think they'd be in huge trouble. I remember asking somebody at an early intervention center. I was at an early intervention center with experts, and they were like, I cannot give you my personal opinion. I had to go through a psychological evaluation with a psychologist. I think it's legal. I think it's lawsuits. I don't know.
Protect themselves. I think you had one other mental health thing.
Oh yeah. So there is a biological overlap. So there is actually a lot of research. I've been paying attention to this because there's actually research going into genetics of neurodivergent brains and bodies currently happening. And so that's exciting that there's research going into it. And so there's actually a biological factor that makes us more at risk for mental health stuff too. And actually physical stuff too.
Okay.
Yeah. And I don't know anything. I just know it's being researched. But I do have
someone's looking into it.
I do have my theories because there is like a gene mutation that oftentimes is connected. I don't know, but
Well,
Anyway,
that's what I was going to ask, is neurodivergence to some extent genetic, or
and that's what they're testing right now too. They're also testing that. I
or is
think
it
at
like
the University of Utah they have a test going currently about it, but
oh, okay.
yeah, I'm super interested because I think it's partly genetic, but that's my personal experience.
I just mean, if all of your kids, I know 2 of them are not biological.
Yeah, it is interesting. Yeah. So that's one of my theories, but we'll find out in the near future, hopefully.
Okay, let's hop back to the diagnosing thing.
Yeah. Let's see. So I think in general, a diagnosis can just help somebody understand themselves better, like we talked about with like stimulation, mental health, just knowing how and why our brains work the way they do. That is, so I like labels, and I think information is power, knowledge is power, and support and help, and so many things, great things come with the information.
How do your kids feel about labels?
I think they are gatekeepers of that, and I think, are protective of who they share that with.
Knowledge is power and gives you resources to be able to be your best self.
And helps people.
Especially depending on how extreme on the spectrum you are, that can be extremely important. I've heard a couple of stories of people getting fired over things with bosses or people over them that weren't aware of some of those social things that they were navigating. So I guess that is huge.
Yeah, and that's so sad because I wonder if their boss knew, if they would be more willing to. Yeah, that is sad.
No, that's okay. So you touched on this a little bit, but I don't know if you have other thoughts on what some of the hurdles are for you and your family. What are some of those barriers to entry, whether that be social, whether that be in work or school? And
Yeah, let's see. For me, it was school was hard growing up. I was always in La La Land daydreaming. I mentioned earlier I learned soft skills. And so my teachers liked me, but I was labeled as ditzy or whatever because I was just like in my own little world. But then I think like working, like realizing I didn't want to sit at a desk for work. I was like, I've got to be on my feet working with my hands. So that's where the hair school interest came from. And I'm super grateful I did that and realized that was a strength of mine. And I've since done like photography, videography, and learned what the things I like are. And I think sometimes I have, oh, I wonder if I had, knowing what I know now, like I couldn't go back to school right now, or I wouldn't want to with my kids still at home. But I have thought, knowing what I know now, could I have done college? And I still just don't have a whole lot of interest in learning about a lot of subjects. I did like a semester of college when I was pregnant with my oldest, and I just don't sit and listen. I like need to be moving. So even like when I go to conferences and stuff, if I'm the videographer, I'm like stoked because you're not going to see me sitting in a seat. I got to be walking around, listening from around the corner, doing yoga. So I feel like I have landed the things that have fit me really well. I was in retail last year, and I think just like working with people and moving, I just have to be moving. So that's worked well for me. But I have wondered if I knew more about my brain, then would I have? And I don't know. I've been like, maybe I would have done the 2-year business school. I'm totally an entrepreneur. You'll find a lot of entrepreneurs, neurodivergent entrepreneurs.
I see that a lot, actually.
Yeah.
Anything else? Any other hurdles for you and your family, or barriers to entry? School was one.
Yeah, I guess just the biggest hurdles have been academics, having those different superpowers, but also those parts of our brains that school is really hard for. My kids haven't entered the workforce yet, but I think finding the right careers, we'll find them. They have very unique gifts and talents. So I'm anxious and excited to see what they decide to do. I had some people where the social pressure of going to college is feeling that, like graduating high school and people being like, are you going to college? Are you going to college? And oh, you're not going to college. I remember that. And I think that's something too that could be that, and along with a lot of other social norms that not everybody fits in the same mold and wants to do the same things, and what works for one person might not work for another. So I definitely have a lot more, I don't know, I think it's taught me a lot over the years about asking and being curious about other people, like what you're doing. Staying curious though, without judgment. And you just never know why or what's going on for somebody that they might be making, maybe doing something differently than you.
Yeah. I actually do hate that. I hate that we have, at least in our society and culture, such strict, in my opinion, like social norms. There's just 100 ways to do things, especially now, to have a fulfilling, happy, successful life. But I think a lot of people try and force themselves into the square. And I don't like seeing people do that because they could be much better in a different, doing something different. But is there so much pressure to fit in? We don't need people to fit in. I hate that. So
Yeah.
I'm glad you did it.
Thanks. You're so sweet.
I'm curious now. Something you said made me wonder if there is anything that you would share about being like a parent to kids that are neurodivergent. And you have an interesting insight because you are neurodivergent, so you have that empathy already. But I'm wondering if there's anything that you could speak to as like a parent.
Yeah. Oh gosh, I didn't expect to get emotional about this. But yeah, that logic of staying curious and asking questions can definitely apply to any parent. I think we can't really assume or guess or judge. We have no idea how somebody might be processing something, or maybe something they've gone through or experienced. Like even in our own kids, we have no idea their life experiences. We haven't walked in their shoes. So I think applying that concept to parenting and asking lots of questions and being a safe person for your children and being their best advocate. Yeah.
I think you have to think about things that a lot of us or a lot of parents don't have to think about. Like you said, you had to really push to get IEP or like resources for your kids in school or you have to be thinking about things that other people aren't having to think about at all. And yes, I was thinking about that to you as a mother. It's like really hard. I have toddlers, so we haven't reached a lot of deeper, stickier situations, but even small things such as health, it's like you just want to give them the best. And yeah, think about you having to go to bat frequently, probably. Sounds like just a lot of work.
Yes.
And so I feel for you. I empathize with you. Keep it
Thanks. That's so sweet. You're the best. Thank you. Yeah.
up.
I do feel like I don't call it special needs, I call it extra needs. When people ask, I'm like, yeah, we've got extra needs. With extra needs, there's extra level of love and empathy, extra lessons, extra things learned. I'm grateful for the opportunity. And even though sometimes it can feel hard and extra, the goodness and the blessings that come with it are extra too.
That's good. That segues us into what are some of those, what are the good things, what are the blessings, what are the privileges? Especially on this podcast, I talk to a lot of people whose stories maybe aren't shared. And a lot of those people are coming from marginalized communities and we see them as marginalized. But on the flip side of everyone's story are just kind of like you said, superpowers. There's blessings, there's privileges that they have that I don't have, not being in that space. And so instead of just only focusing on the hard, I'd love to hear if there's anything really beautiful and has blessed you and your family because of some of those experiences you have.
Yeah, I definitely see it's interesting because in one kid, I'll see the perfectionism and the rule follower and the other things that are a lot more like rigid. And I'm like, and that serves him. And then I'll see another kid and they are spontaneous and they don't think before they act and they get into all kinds of trouble. And it's like literally biological, like it's how their brains are functioning. Yeah, I think I don't know. I'm trying to think of how I can sit. I guess there's those superpowers that you can look at as privileges too. I don't know. And there's talents, definitely. I think everybody's got talents in their different areas, but
Has it helped you like empathize with other people that are in the same space as you or that are in like completely different spaces? I have to go to
Yeah.
bat for my kid. I'm sure you have to go to bat for your kid.
Yeah.
Wait, I don't know if
Okay.
that's one thing or
Yeah, my kids are probably some of they are so nice.
Mhm,
They're always like finding the kid that's sitting by themselves.
mhm,
And I think when you've experienced being the kid by yourself, there's a level of like compassion and empathy learned.
mhm.
And I know how that feels. And I'm not going to sit around and let anybody else ever feel like that. Yeah.
I love to hear that. Yeah, when you know how something feels, you're just more aware. Just like you said, one of your kids is really aware when someone's maybe feeling certain things. Oh.
Or if somebody's being teased, like if somebody's being teased, my kids will come home and tell me stories, and I cry all the time hearing the
Mm,
ways that they are defending and standing up to meanness and bullying. And then sometimes they, as a result, will deal with some bullying themselves when they
mm.
intervene. But that's maturity I don't think most kids get
Yeah,
to experience.
that's cool.
Yeah.
Okay, how can we be better as community members, as friends, neighbors? You've given us a ton of
Um,
information just to empathize with, but is there any suggestions you would say, do this? Now's your chance.
yeah. Okay, so there are I think talking about what being on the spectrum or being neurodivergent, there are some things we can talk and teach to the younger generation or just adults too, because I think a lot of adults don't understand it either. But things that you can recognize on the outside, one of the things is like stimming. People on the spectrum or that are neurodivergent will sometimes stim, whether that's like twisting a piece of hair or bouncing or like doing something repetitive with their hand or tapping motion, flapping, stomping, something that's like repetitive. And so that's one thing you can watch for. A lot of times, avoiding eye contact is another clue. Yeah, there's lots of outward things that can manifest that can help people recognize when somebody's neurodivergent. And I think just like having awareness of that and teaching about it and advocating for like recognition and then teaching the kindness and acceptance. I think neurodivergent people are more likely to be misunderstood or mistreated. That's probably what I'd say.
Yeah, no, that's huge. I try and think about that a lot because sometimes when you just have different, you're thinking about things different, you approach things differently. Just like you said, people coming off blunt and saying the truth could really hurt someone else's feelings or get you fired from a job. But to
Yeah.
be aware, at least in the back of your mind, like before jumping to a conclusion, maybe
Right.
someone is their brain's working differently than mine. And so before I overreact, let me be curious, just like you said.
Yeah. Yeah, for sure.
Yeah.
People are doing the best they can with whatever circumstances and experiences they have.
Yeah. Okay, my last question I just thought of. Can you think of any examples of people that have been really curious or empathetic to you, your kids, your family at large?
Oh, we've been shown so much kindness and grace and love. And it's hard to think of a specific example. When my kids were little, I was pretty open about it, like on playgrounds and things. And I feel like most people are very understanding and loving, especially when they have information. And I think as a whole, we've just been shown so much love. So I feel super grateful for that.
That's cool. With information, you're more kind, you're more empathetic. And I think that speaks to this whole thing that I'm trying to do is with information, with someone's story, with someone's like being face to face with someone comes more empathy because you just understand there's more to think about.
Yes.
Is there anything else that you have wanted to share with the community that you would say is like important in regards to this topic of being neurodivergent?
No, I think it goes along with the point of your podcast, being willing to sit and listen to somebody's story and being willing to have an open mind and sitting with people. I love your podcast. I love your whole idea and theme. And I think it's amazing. But just to go right along with that, staying curious about people, asking questions and getting to know people. But yeah, I love that. And I'm pretty open about my neurodivergence. I'm a little more like my kids have their own stories to share and figure out. So I'm not quite as open as for all of their like experiences. They're incredible humans. Yeah, they're amazing. And they definitely have their fair share of struggles and extra stressors, but they are super incredible. Yeah.
They have a really awesome mom.
Oh, that's so
Thank you so much for being here. You're wonderful.
Thanks for having me.